Howdy, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Mark Welsh, the very lucky Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. And I'm very proud tonight to represent the George and Barbara Bush Foundation and the Bush School Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. By the way, a very distinguished representative of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation will join us a little bit later this evening. I'm incredibly excited about tonight's conversation with this amazingly diverse panel. We have a young man from Kansas who became an Eagle Scout and went on to become president of the Boy Scouts of America. We have a former assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor who went on to become a great American statesman. We have a scholar with a PhD in Russian and Soviet history from Georgetown University and 7 honorary doctorates from other great American universities who went on to become a beloved president of Texas A&M University. We have an author of 4 best-selling books who went on to become chancellor of the College of William and Mary, his undergraduate alma mater. We have an intelligence analyst who went on to serve as the deputy director and then the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And we have a young Air Force lieutenant intelligence officer who went on to serve as Secretary of Defense. Now, our production team says they can somehow squeeze all of them into that one little Zoom square on your screen. So I guess it's good that all those people are really just one superhuman being. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege to welcome an American icon, Secretary Dr. Bob Gates. Mr. Secretary, it's wonderful to see you tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that overly generous introduction.
I don't think so. Sir, we're here tonight to talk about your new book. This is it, The Exercise of Power. It's a good-looking book to start with. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's essentially a single-volume history of American foreign and security policy over the past 30 years. And it is absolutely fascinating. Mr. Secretary, there's a story behind every book. Why did you decide to write this one? And what were you hoping to accomplish by doing so?
Mark, I think it really began with reading a biography by Gene Smith of Dwight D. Eisenhower. And in the book, it's described how Eisenhower, during a period of great crisis during the 1950s, facing a nuclear Russia, nuclear Soviet Union, a surging China, and during his administration, a nuclear China, the war in Vietnam, and the French wanting our assistance. On 2 occasions, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended that Eisenhower use nuclear weapons, once at Dien Bien Phu to help the French, and another time to take on the Chinese. We had revolutions in Poland and East Germany and Hungary, and later in Cuba. All the tensions of the Cold War, crises over the Taiwan Straits and Taiwan. And yet, from the moment Eisenhower signed the armistice agreement in Korea in July of 1950 until he left office in January of 1961, not one American soldier died in combat. And the thought occurred to me, how did he do that? And then I was thinking back over the last 25 years or so, 20 years of war, where the United States had gone from a position of extraordinary predominance, singular power at the end of the Cold War, to where we are today, beset by challenges at every turn, from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, paralyzed at home. And it occurred to me, why did that happen? How did that happen? And what can we do to reverse it? It isn't enough just to complain, but how do you change that trajectory? And so that really is what the book is about. And there's a reason why the subtitle begins with failures rather than successes, because of the 15 case studies in the book of virtually every major foreign policy challenge over the last 30 years. I really only write about 2 unalloyed successes. And so the question is, how can we avoid those mistakes in the future? And one of the themes of the book, going back to the Eisenhower analogy, is the over-militarization of our foreign policy. That that at the end of the Cold War, we dismantled all of the non-military instruments of power that were so important to our success in the Cold War, and we're left with the military. And as the old saying goes, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
So you mentioned the subtitle. I probably should have made sure everybody heard it. It's Exercise of Power, American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War World. I love how logically this book is laid out. You start by talking about what are the tools of power, a little bit about the way presidents use those tools of power, and then you give 15 examples, good and bad, straight from the headlines of the last 30 years, and finish with lessons that you hope policymakers can draw from those experiences. I have a number of questions that have been submitted by members of the audience tonight ahead of time, and I'll mix those in as we go through this conversation. And to those of you who submitted, I promise we'll get as many as we can in. But let me start with the first chapter, because I absolutely love the title of chapter 1, Symphony of Power. Would you take us through the instruments that are part of that symphony, and maybe which one we've used well and not so well over the past 30 years?
Well, there are a number. Obviously, the most coercive, and as I suggested, probably the one used the most in the last quarter of a century is the military, which kind of goes without saying. Another coercive instrument of power that's relatively new is cyber. And cyber is, I think, in some ways the most powerful of all the instruments of power today, because it can be used militarily, politically, and economically. It can be used to dismantle infrastructure. It can be used to either thwart or change the direction of weapons. It can be used to get into people's political systems and try and affect elections and so on. So cyber is another very important instrument of power. Economics are clearly important. I mean, both in a positive and a negative sense. So we use sanctions all the time in the United States. In fact, we've reached a point where if a country kind of looks cross-eyed at us anymore, we'll levy sanctions on them. But there are also positive tools such as development assistance and concessionary loans and so on. There's a raft of subsets in the economic arena. Intelligence is an asset, is an instrument of power, both in terms of how it informs our own government, but how our government uses it to shape the views of other governments or through covert action. Strategic communications is a critical instrument of power. And in 1998, the Congress dismantled, eliminated the United States Information Agency. And tried to eliminate the United States Agency for International Development. Clinton allowed the first to happen, but not the second, but it was tucked under the State Department. So strategic communications are critically important. And we've been reading a lot in recent days about the Chinese effectiveness in developing strategic communications all over the world. A few years ago, President Hu Jintao allocated $7 billion for China to build a global strategic communications network. And ours is a pale reflection of that. Religion is important. As we've seen, the power of religion in terms of the terrorist threat, but also, frankly, as a way of trying to get people to behave in a better way. Our ideology, our American ideology, our belief in freedom and human rights is an instrument of power for the United States. Our alliances are an extraordinarily important asset as an instrument of power. This is one of the things that concerns me most about right now. The United States is unique in having allies. Russia and China have no allies. They have clients, but they have no allies. And properly using and assembling our allies, as some presidents have done, is an extraordinary instrument of power. So those are mainly the instruments, but there's things like science and technology. There's higher education, where we bring foreign students over here and educate them, expose them to American democracy and the way of life. So there are many instruments of power. And the way I came up with the title of the chapter was that when they're all working together, when all these instruments of power are integrated in a strategy toward another country, as we did toward the Soviet Union, it really constitutes a symphony of power. Unfortunately, we haven't had much of that in the last 30 years.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, it's a fantastic title of a chapter. There's another fantastic quote in the book that I really, really liked. It was, "America's power lies in its ideals." And if we assume that that's true, is it possible to separate politics today from concern over democratic ideals? And if so, how can our leaders express concern with foreign policy without being seen as engaging in or accused of being partisan?
Look, the United States political system has been partisan from the very beginning. I'm reading a brand new biography of James Monroe, and it's just a refresher course in how ugly the politics were, even in Washington's second term. And the things that Jefferson and Adams called each other would fit right into today's political dialogue. So we have, there's been this, we're dealing with this virus. And one of the anecdotes one of the things that I came across in this book was that there was a wave of yellow fever that hit Philadelphia in the mid 1790s. And the Federalists had a doctor, Benjamin Rush, who had signed the Declaration of Independence, who still believed in leeches and bleeding and stuff like that. So that was the Federalist cure for the yellow fever. And the Republicans under Jefferson thought the cure was under a guy named Stevens, who was treating it with something called quinine. But you had Republican and Federalist cures for the yellow fever. And it sort of sounded familiar, in all honesty. And so we've always had partisanship, and it's all, and we think about the past in some kind of idyllic way, but it's, American politics have always been rough and tumble. The difference has been, for the most part, you didn't identify those with whom you disagreed as enemies. You could be friends and even colleagues, and yet work together or oppose each other on specific issues. And I think what has happened for us is polarization and politics and partisanship have morphed into paralysis, where we can't get anything done. And this is the most damaging thing right now. And it's not new with President Trump. It goes back a number of years. And I would say it really began to get ugly after the end of the Cold War. And maybe it was the absence of an overriding threat to the country that contributed to this. But the inability, particularly in recent years, to deal with any of the major issues facing the country, whether it's infrastructure or education or immigration or a host of other issues. And that's what's really dangerous right now. And it's undermining the perception of America around the world as not only a form of government to emulate, but that we actually are incredibly competent and can do big things. So I think our partisanship in changing to paralysis has been a big negative for the United States around the world. And if you combine that with the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, that called into question our economic model, it's what creates an environment in which President Xi Jinping's China can say, look at us, look at all the things we've accomplished. Our system works and theirs doesn't anymore. And that's a big concern for me.
Yes, sir. One of our questions tonight was actually, does being unable to govern ourselves effectively make the U.S. a failing or a faltering state?
I would say it makes us a faltering state. It's not making us a failed state, but we really have to do something about this. And I always get asked, what's the biggest security threat to the United States? And I say the biggest threat to the United States is found within the 2 square miles that encompass the White House and the Capitol building. Because if we can't if we can't figure out how to work together to solve some of our problems, there's no foreign threat that compares with the damage that does.
Yes, sir. If our power does lie in our ideals, then are you saying that our power is growing or is it declining?
I would say right now that it's declining. I think that the United States has not been a vocal an advocate for human rights and for freedom in recent years, and frankly, the current racial turmoil that we're going through further, I think, damages us in the eyes of people abroad. You know, nobody around the world has ever seen us as a perfect society. They've always known that we are flawed, like every country. But I think where America earned a lot of credit over the decades was we were always perceived as working to perfect our flaws. We were always working to perfect our society and to diminish or eliminate our flaws. We were never self-satisfied. We never told ourselves we had it all right. And we were always working to get at these problems. And that's what differentiated us from authoritarian societies and from other societies. They had these same problems, but they didn't care. But the United States has for a long time really tried to ameliorate these problems and to remedy these historic tragedies that we've had. And we got a lot of credit for that abroad, and especially as long as we, like during the Cold War, stood for principles of political liberty and for democracy. The people in Eastern Europe in particular really valued that in the latter part of the Cold War and thought they had a friend in the United States, and they did.
So let me shift gears just a little bit to another one of their audience questions, and it's a fairly timely one based on recent events. Can you address the dual role of the National Guard as both a warfighter and first responder, and the complexity this adds to the president's decision to mobilize them as one of those tools of power?
Sure. I was one of those who was very much in agreement with General Mattis and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, and Marty Dempsey in opposing the use of the Insurrection Act to put down the protests, particularly in Lafayette Square. And I think part of it is because most Americans don't understand the difference between the regular Army and the National Guard. The regular Army is primarily taught to do one thing, and that's kill our enemies. They're not trained in crowd control or law enforcement or things like that. The National Guard, on the other hand, it has multiple roles. You're as likely to see them working right now at a food bank as anything else, or helping with sandbags for a flooding river. But they also do crowd control, and they're actually trained in crowd control, and they have good relationships with local law enforcement. And the thing to remember about the National Guard is they nearly always come from the towns and cities where they are deployed. And so they will take off the uniform the next day and be in a shop or a place of business where they will deal with the people that they were probably trying to control the night before. So there's a whole different mindset and attitude on the part of the National Guard. They can fight, believe me, and I saw it both in Iraq, especially in Iraq, where you had National Guard units in combat. But they primarily are truly citizen soldiers, and they have a different mindset than the regular Army. So I think regular Army should be used domestically only in the most extreme circumstances. And in my view, what I saw at Lafayette Square, local and federal law enforcement, bolstered by the National Guard, had that situation well in hand, and it was a good decision not to use the regular Army.
Yes, sir. Thank you. In the section of your book that you dedicate to the process of exercising power, you highlight wise and courageous leadership as critical to the successful execution of foreign policy. And you're not shy in the book about your opinions of which presidents were most and least successful in doing that. Can you give us some thoughts on that?
Well, I think, and maybe it's because I'm a child of the Cold War. I thought the two wisest presidents that I worked for probably were President Reagan and the first President Bush. I think the other presidents all had their strong points, and tell you the truth, I admired all of the presidents that I worked for, except maybe for the first two. I was pretty junior under Lyndon Johnson, and went to the NSC in the last months of the Nixon administration. I like to joke that I joined the Nixon administration. I was hired at the Nixon administration. It was like signing on to the Titanic as a deckhand after it had hit the iceberg. But the other six presidents I all admired. I admired all of them in one way or another. And they were all people of integrity and people that I thought were trying to do the right thing for the American people, even though I disagreed sometimes with their policies.
Okay, sir. You've talked about it a little bit tonight already when you talked about cyber, but in the book, you talk about the importance of strategic communications using all the tools that are available to a president. Can you talk more about how you see that working today or how we can improve it?
Well, public diplomacy is now the buzzword for strategic communications, or propaganda, if you will. And the problem is first of all, it's dispersed around the government. Every department of government has its own PR and communications outlets, and they all have their own messages. There's very little coordination among them, even in the foreign policy arena. So the State Department does its thing, and the Defense Department does its thing, and so on. And so we not only lack integration of our strategic communications, we lack the capabilities. I mentioned a minute ago that Hu Jintao devoted $7 billion to building out their systems, but we dismantled the worldwide system we had with the United States Information Agency. And that was an extraordinarily effective strategic communications device, institution, especially in its heyday, when, under Edward R. Murrow and under President Kennedy and under Charlie Wick in the Reagan administration. The radios that we have, the VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, belong to an agency, the Agency for Global Media, that really has no connection at all with the policy community or the State Department. Now, how can that possibly be? This agency spends $700 million a year, and they're not integrated into any strategic communications programs of the United States government, and resent the possibility of their ever having to coordinate or be told, given a particular line that they ought to push in terms of American interests. So you have all these different pieces of the puzzle, but you also lack, where is our forward-leaning cyber capability to figure out how to break through the firewalls in China and Russia and Iran to tell the people of those countries what their leaders are really like and about the corruption that they have and so on. We don't have a very aggressive strategy in that respect. And so I think that we need both we need to significantly bolster our capabilities institutionally, but there also needs to be a government-wide integrated communication strategy, particularly when it comes to dealing with our adversaries.
Thank you, sir. The 15 specific foreign policy examples that you cover in the book literally span the globe. They are phenomenally interesting windows into decision-making at the presidential level, in my view. China is one of the case studies you offer. Would you share your thoughts on a more effective and clear-eyed relationship with China going forward?
Well, Xi Jinping has been able to accomplish something no one in this country has been able to accomplish, and that is bring the Republicans and the Democrats together. China is the only area of, I think, domestic and foreign policy where there's actually now sort of bipartisan agreement on the need for a tougher line toward China. I think it's the result of the realization that our 40-year assumption that a richer China would be a freer China proved not to be the case. And we really didn't also take into account that a richer China would be a more assertive China. So now we have pretty broad-based bipartisan agreement on getting tough with China. The question is, how do you get tough with China, and how do you prevent a rivalry or a competition from becoming a military confrontation? Both sides know that would be catastrophic for each country. So the question is, are there some specific areas where we can cooperate? And whether it's in disaster relief or humanitarian assistance, or in trying to deal with the COVID disease, or some specific areas of where we can cooperate in the context of what I believe will be a decades-long rivalry. And how do we make sure we keep it in the non-military instruments of power, that's where this rivalry will be fought out. And frankly, that's one of the important takeaways from the book, is that these instruments of power that I've been talking about have been highly developed by China over the last 10 or 15 years. And whilst ours have continued to wither, and if we're going to compete with China in the decades ahead, we're going to have to rebuild these capabilities along with strengthening our military. I think that one of the things that's missing that is really important in our dealings with China is our failure to build a consensus among our allies on how to deal with this country. Just think, so if our biggest issues with China economically are in some of the structural questions about investment policy and protection of intellectual property and joint ventures and things like that, just think how much more powerful our bargaining position would be if on our side of the table, we had, with one set of talking points, ourselves, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Indians, the Australians, and others, all telling China the same thing and saying, if you don't make these changes, you will pay a price for it in our economic dealings with you. So I think the failure to assemble our allies and to speak with one voice to the Chinese on some of these issues, including their aggressive posture in the South China Sea, is a big deficiency in U.S. policy, and it's a big opportunity missed, it seems to me.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, using the model for exercising power that you present in the book, how would you grade our national and international efforts to both prepare for and respond to our current pandemic?
Well, I think that in some ways the evaluation of our effort has sort of been expressed today by the European Union in saying that we won't let Brazilians, Russians, and Americans come to Europe because they don't have the coronavirus under control. I think that there are two pieces of this, well, three pieces. The first is, I think it was correct to leave decisions on closed downs or shutdowns and openings up to the states and up to municipalities. One size clearly doesn't fit all, even within a given state. And so devolving that authority to the local, those closest to the scene, I think made a lot of sense. But, and maybe here I'm sort of speaking as a former Secretary of Defense, if the American military does one thing superbly, it's logistics. And I think that the federal government should have taken charge of providing the equipment necessary to deal with the virus to the states. The notion of the states having to bid against each other for masks and gowns and ventilators and stuff, and have to go overseas and try and find sourcing, I think was just awful. And that's where the federal government could have been very, very helpful. I think the messaging has been poor and inconsistent from the national level, as well as in many states from the state level. And then I guess the third part that disturbs me also is frankly the irresponsibility, particularly of a lot of younger people, in not having a sense of civic responsibility of being willing to mask up, not only for their own protection, but for the protection of others in their community. And it's this sort of selfishness, it's all about me and I don't care about anybody else has been very disturbing and kind of discouraging to me. I would have hoped for a broader community of mind in the United States, and particularly among the younger generation, of saying, this is the right thing to do for everybody. This is not about politics. This distancing and wearing masks is not partisan. It's not political. It's just common sense. And so that's the third piece of this that I have found disappointing.
Thank you, sir. You list 8 major lessons learned at the end of your book. Now, can you highlight one of them that you think may be the most significant?
I think that if there's one message in the book, it is that the military has been asked to do things over the past 20 years that it is neither trained nor equipped to do. And it's been asked to do those things because the civilian elements that have that expertise have been so weak. Condi Rice used to remind me or tell me all the time that I had more people in military bands than she had in the Foreign Service. When it came time in both Iraq and Afghanistan to do nation building, they're just the preponderance of military power and the inadequacy of civilian expertise was a huge and continuing problem in both countries. And so the military was asked to take on tasks that they really were not equipped or trained, as I said, to manage. And that one of the tools that was used, especially in Iraq, was something called the Provincial Reconstruction Team, and it was supposedly a military civilian integrated effort to help at the local level in terms of getting schools open, getting sewers running, getting water supplies, doing the kinds of civilian activities that at least give people a sense of security and that they can get back to their daily lives. At the height of the U.S. presence in Iraq, we had 170,000 troops in Iraq. There were about 350 civilians involved in the PRTs. And in Afghanistan, there were more people on the NSC staff working on Iraq and Afghanistan than there were civilians in the PRTs in Afghanistan. So there's just this incredibly lopsided presence in these countries in terms of what we were trying to accomplish. And the military was given missions that it had no business being assigned.
Thank you. Let me shift gears for just a minute. Our 2 sponsors tonight, of course, the George and Barbara Bush Foundation and the Scowcroft Institute, both have namesakes who were central to the exercise of power you describe in your book. Now, we've discussed President Bush already, and I think many people believe General Scowcroft was the model national security advisor. You were part of a pretty formidable team in those days. And another member of that team is here tonight as the newly appointed CEO of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation. And I'd like to ask him to join us for the remainder of the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, an 8-year member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, a patriot who served in the White House for 3 different presidents, former Secretary of Transportation and White House Chief of Staff, the Honorable Andy Card. Andy, I know you don't mind making a couple of comments, so over to you.
Thank you very much, General. It's wonderful to be with you and great to be with Bob Gates. Bob Gates and I had the privilege of being on the official B team at the White House when he was Deputy National Security Advisor and I was Deputy White House Chief of Staff. So we spent a lot of time together. I have great respect for you, Bob. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the Bush School and being its first dean.
Thank you. It's hard for me to believe, Andy, that as we were talking earlier, that it's been a little over 20 years since I arrived at the Bush School.
Well, the Bush School is a remarkable institution, and it is truly the living legacy of George H.W. Bush. And the purpose of the school is to invite young people to come in and understand the value and, quite frankly, the rewards that are not financial, but tremendous rewards of public service. And you certainly personify that. But George H.W. Bush was the living example that we witnessed do his job so well. And he brought us into service that we never dreamed we'd have and gave us experiences. But more than that, he made a difference to the world. And he left America a better place after his service.
That's for sure.
Thank you, Andy. Secretary Gates, would you talk specifically for a moment about how President Bush actually exercised power with and through the foreign policy team he assembled? I mean, who were these people really? How did he use them? What are the things every American should know about them or the things they accomplished?
No, I wrote in an earlier book that if I were ever asked by a president to advise him on putting together him or her putting together a cabinet, and particularly in the national security arena, what would my advice be? And that would be, you need to think of the individuals that you appoint in the context of a team. Because for a good part of my career, the secretaries of state and defense didn't speak to each other. They really loathed each other, and it was not helpful to smooth policy making. President Bush, 41, assembled a team in the national security arena, first of all, where every senior member of that team had known each other and worked together before. Jim Baker, Dick Cheney as Secretary of Defense, Brent Scowcroft as National Security Advisor. All these people had known each other in the Ford administration, worked together in the Ford administration, and they had stayed in touch and had worked together for a long time. And so there was a congeniality. And believe me, they didn't always agree at all, but they were friends. And so you'd have Cheney and Baker go off to Wyoming fishing together. That just didn't happen with secretaries of state and defense in any previous administration. And so you had people who weren't afraid to disagree, but it was in the context of a collegiality. And I would also say an extraordinary loyalty to the president. And that loyalty was returned. And maybe I should turn that on its head, because he gave all of those people his loyalty. They were loyal to him. And one of the things that struck me was that there were really, on the national security side, I don't think there was ever a significant leak in the entire Bush 41 administration. It was a great source of frustration for the press, but people just didn't, that's a way of fighting policy battles when you don't feel like you're being taken seriously by the president or by the White House. And so that kind of gamesmanship didn't get played. And we had this deputies committee, and one thing that brought the domestic and the foreign policy sides of the White House together for the first time, really to prevent misunderstandings or gaps, was that we invited Andy as the deputy White House chief of staff to be a member of the deputies committee. So Andy was welcome in any meeting that I chaired on a national security issue. And that way he knew what was going on in terms of the domestic politics and the domestic policy area. But we also got wisdom from him in terms of, kind of here's what the president can deliver on the Hill. Here's what we can get done domestically and so on. So it was an integrated effort, both among the different agencies, but between the domestic and the foreign policy sides of the White House, that frankly, I think was unprecedented. I don't know of any administration before that or after that operated so smoothly, and particularly given the magnitude of the issues that they ended up facing.
Secretary Card, anything you'd add to that?
Well, I do think that the value that Brent Scowcroft brought to the process, he actually did a study of what had happened during the Iran-Contra problems in terms of organization within the White House. So he helped to present, I'm going to say, a better way for the national security team and the domestic side of the White House to be integrated, not necessarily on policy, but really on the cadence of responsibility in the White House. So there was and I give Brent a lot of credit for that, but it was Bob Gates, who was kind of the boots on the ground, that invited people to get along.
The other thing I'd say about Brent was that unlike most national security advisors, and I worked for a bunch of them, including Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Brent. Unlike most national security advisors, Brent was really trusted by the other principals on the team. they knew he had his own views and his own positions, and he would share those, and he would try and convince Bush of what he believed. But he was also scrupulously honest in making sure Bush knew what each of those people, what their positions were, and always facilitating getting them in to see the president if they wanted to present their views directly to the president. And so there was a level of trust there that I think was kind of the grease that made everything work.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Card, I recently heard you tell a story that I thought was wonderful in terms of the actual exercise of power, the decision-making that went behind it, and how eventually it comes down, in many cases, to one person in our system. Can you talk about the decision related to Manuel Noriega in Panama?
Sure. First of all, Manuel Noriega was the leader of Panama, and he was a bad guy. And most of America wasn't paying a lot of attention, but he actually kidnapped some Americans down at the Canal Zone. One of them was probably a member of the CIA. And he was playing footsie with all the bad guys and the drug cartels. And it was a big problem. But America was not debating the issue. The National Security Council was, and the Deputies Committee was very, very involved in it. And we came to a point of time where something had to be done. And there were a number of recommendations. And I remember the ultimate meeting took place in the Oval Office. And General Scowcroft was there, the National Security Advisor, obviously, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Chief of Staff, Bob Gates there. I was there as I was in charge of the easel and the charts and the satellite photographs. And I remember the conversation was very, very serious. And each of the principals had a comment to make. Secretary of State Jim Baker, after the meeting had gone on for about 40 minutes, stood up. And the president was sitting at a chair in front of the fireplace, and the vice president was there. And the Secretary of State stood up and said, "Mr. President, I'm leaving you to your decision, because the decision that's going to be made is not my decision. It's not our decision. It's your decision. And I'm leaving you to the decision. You've got all the information. You've heard from all of us. And so I'm going to leave you to your decision." And he started walking out of the room. Everybody else kind of didn't know what to do, but they decided to walk out of the room as well. So everybody marched out of the room. The president got up from his chair in front of the fireplace and went behind his desk, which was on the other side of the Oval Office. And he sat at his desk as I was picking up charts off the floor and starting to fold up the easel. And he had his eyes shut. His hands were folded. He was looking down, and I'm convinced he was praying. And then just as I'm starting to fold up the easel and put the charts under my arm, he looks right through me. It was as if I wasn't there. I was just a piece of furniture. But he said something that I will never forget, because he said, "I'm making a decision that will cost young men their lives." And then he got up, didn't say a word to me, and he walked out the door of the Oval Office to the Rose Garden and started walking around the south grounds of the White House. And I remember thinking, I just watched the president make a presidential decision. And I was so impressed that he made it on what the likely consequence would be to an American. And it wasn't based on what the NSC staff said. It wasn't based on anything outside. He understood, he put it in the context of a tough decision that a president makes. And only the president can make that decision, to send young men and women and to make sacrifices that the president would never want to invite on anybody. But he had to make those decisions. So it was a very sobering experience for me, especially when I learned a month later that we were going to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I would always check to see what letters had come in from the zip codes where we were going. And there was a letter from a woman who said, I want to meet with the president, and I want to be able to call him a murderer to his face because he murdered my son. That got my attention. Long story short, it was a young man that had died in Panama, and the president did meet with that family when he went to Cincinnati. And I'll never forget the meeting. And the president said that he couldn't have done his job if it wasn't for the kinds of people that her son was, who served in the military and gave his life for the country.
Let me offer a different, but an additive to Andy's story, and it has to do with the Gulf War. Bush was amazingly fun to work with. He had the greatest sense of humor. He loved practical jokes. He was just he often was just hilarious, and there was a lot of laughter all the time in the Oval Office. I mean, and in the Situation Room. Partly that's how you deal with situations of extraordinary. That's how sane people deal with situations of extraordinary stress. But I remember vividly that once he made the decision to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, his sense of humor literally disappeared, and you could just see the weight of the decision, because the estimates of how many American kids might get killed were just extraordinary. I mean, thousands and thousands, and so on. And his sense of humor literally went away, I would say, for a period of about 4 months, the lead up to and then until the conclusion of the war. And it slowly began to come back in the spring of 1990. But there was no joking around in the Oval Office anymore. It was the weight of that decision on him was just extraordinary.
Thank you, sir. As it turns out, both of you were just getting started really on your national leadership journeys. You were already incredibly accomplished, but you were just getting going when you served on the 41st President's team. Is there one thing in particular that you took away from watching President Bush in action that made you a better leader and senior decision maker throughout the remainder of your remarkable careers? Secretary Gates, let me start with you.
It would be very difficult to pick one thing. I mean, he just exhibited so many leadership skills. One thing that always impressed me was how he treated everyone with respect and dignity. And he treated cabinet officers and the grounds crew at the White House exactly the same way. He'd ask about their families. He knew their names. He knew the names of their children. He cared about individuals. He treated everybody so decently, and nobody ever forgot that. His willingness to entertain different points of view, his encouragement of disagreement in front of him, encouraged people to take issue with where he might be heading, and treated those people with respect. He never exhibited, he got mad plenty. Every president does, but he never was demonstrative in his anger. And I guess the other thing that I would say, and for him, I suppose Andy could speak to the domestic side, but I saw it on the foreign side. He had a unique empathy for other leaders, and he cultivated them in a unique way. We would be sitting in the morning briefing, and he'd say, "I think I'll give Mitterrand a call. It's been a while since I've checked in with him." And there would be no reason and no ask. It was just a friend reaching out to a friend. Or we'd tell him, or he'd hear that some leader's child had either been injured or was sick or had won an award of some kind, and he'd call him to congratulate him. And the result was that when he needed something, no leader is going to go contrary to their national interest, but he had a lot of friends, and they would help him in any way they could. He also, and the best example of this, I think, that had huge historic consequences, was his empathy, his ability to put himself in Gorbachev's shoes. So he got a lot of criticism for failing to dance on the wall when the Berlin Wall came down. That he didn't celebrate enough. He didn't go to Berlin and so on. But what he realized was that Gorbachev was under enormous pressure at home in the Soviet Union, and that the hardliners were really after him at that point. And he was determined not to give Gorbachev's opponents any provocative action that they could use to throw him out and to reverse what was going on in Eastern Europe. And so his empathy for Gorbachev's political problem at home led him to take exactly the right action. I have always believed that had the coup attempt against Gorbachev by the army, the party, and the KGB in August of 1991 been tried in the fall of 1989, it very likely would have succeeded, and all of the ensuing history would have been different. But it was his empathy for others that allowed him to guide the world through the collapse of this empire without a shot being fired.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Card?
Boy, Bob Gates really summed it up pretty well. I would say that George H.W. Bush really would forget people were his enemies, and he would see them as potential friends. And so there were many times on the domestic front when we'd have meetings with people from Capitol Hill, and he would be backslapping and telling how great they were. And one time I said, you know that he just fought you on that bill that you didn't get and made it really tough. He said, oh, I kind of forgot about that, but we'll need him next time. So he probably did that so that he could be with me the next time. So he was very inclusive, and he was also quick to share success. He didn't stand up and say, I did this all. He was very careful to say, you did this, we did this together. And he was very quick to give credit for success. And if there was a problem, he knew when it was his problem, and he could eat his own meal of crow. He didn't like doing it, but he could do it. And unfortunately, he also had to serve a meal of crow to me every once in a while too. But
the other thing that I
would come in with the other side.
The other thing that I would mention that would drive people nuts, especially on the political side, and it's just further to Andy's point, the guy with one or two exceptions, and there were one or two exceptions, he absolutely would not hold a grudge against somebody, no matter how bitter a political enemy.
Absolutely true.
Secretary Gates, so at the Bush School, as you know from your time here, we very rarely talk about President Bush without talking about Barbara Bush. It's always they're a team. It seems like everything. Can you characterize her impact, her influence, her effect on President Bush as a foreign policy decision maker?
Well, I think Barbara, he was often characterized as being very humble and not, avoiding the word I and so on. I think Barbara worked to make sure he was humble. One of my favorite stories, he was talking to some group, it may have been at the Bush School, and he almost never bragged, but in this occasion, it was well after he'd left the presidency, and he was kind of exulting and bragging about the fact that an elementary school there in Texas had been named for him. And Barbara, without missing a beat, said, yeah, by a vote of 4-3. I have to tell you one of my favorite Bush School stories. So there's this bust of President Bush in the lobby of the Bush School. And very early on, a tradition developed that students would rub the nose of the bust for good luck before an exam. And one time I told President Bush that, and that the nose was very bright. And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, thank God it's only a bust.
Oh, boy. Secretary Card, the Bush School is opening up a DC teaching site this fall. We'll have our first student cohort enter next January. Chance to put the flag in the ground, not just for the Bush School, but for Texas A&M. What kind of opportunities do you think this might present for the school, for Texas A&M, and for the George and Barbara Bush Foundation in our nation's capital?
Well, the George and Barbara Bush Foundation is so proud to be on the campus of Texas A&M. And we're particularly proud that we get to interact with the students at the Bush School because they really are the living legacy of President Bush, and they're the future. And George H.W. Bush used to say, I'm the past. So they're the future. But this new campus in Washington, D.C., Texas A&M, the Bush School is going to be a presence that will be remarkable because it means that the students from the Bush School will have a chance to interact with all of the bureaucracies of government to understand what public service means, and they'll get turned on and can't wait to do it. They'll get to understand the maturations of dealing with Congress and dealing with the bureaucratic infighting that takes place, the parochialism. But they'll also have the opportunity to really learn from practitioners. And one of the excellent aspects of the Bush School is that their faculty is an eclectic faculty. It includes people from economics and history and philosophy and I'm going to say hard work, and former CIA officials, former USAID officials. Is just remarkable. But going to Washington, D.C. means that they'll have more access to the people who actually work in the field of public service. And we get to do a lot of other things at the Bush School, which is also talk about the legacy of the Bushes that's not in the form of a graduate of the Bush School. It's the legacy that comes from understanding what he did as president. He was the most successful one-term president in our nation's history. And the successes we like to celebrate in the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, and those successes will be the Americans with Disabilities Act, all that he did for the Clean Air Act, what he did in foreign policy, ending the Cold War without a hot war. And we just love to talk about that, but it's the Bush Museum, the Bush Library, the Bush School that cause people to want to come to Texas A&M and College Station. Now they have a place to go in Washington, D.C. to see some of that history as well. But we're also proud to be associated with the Points of Light Foundation and the Barbara Bush Family Literacy Foundation, all doing great work to make sure that the Bush legacy, George Bush and Barbara Bush legacies, go on forever.
Well done, CEO. Nicely stated. Secretary Gates, a question you probably knew was coming. Of all the positions you've held, and there have been a number of them over time in your 50 years of public service, which was the one you enjoyed the most and would want to return to without hesitation?
Mark, people have asked me if I enjoyed my time as Secretary of Defense. And my answer always was, I found being Secretary of Defense and being responsible for all those young men and women in uniform to be the most gratifying job of my career. But when you're writing condolence letters every night, it's hard to say that it's enjoyable. I think the most enjoyable job that I ever had was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and that was when I was Deputy National Security Advisor for Bush 41. I joined CIA in 1966. I'd been recruited out of the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University, and it was really just to do my bit in the Cold War. And I never dreamed when I joined CIA that I'd be the director of CIA when the Soviet Union collapsed. But to have that academic background and then my time in CIA working on Soviet affairs and Eastern Europe, and then to be in the White House during the 2.5-year period between Bush's inauguration and the end of the Gulf War was a unique moment in history. I mean, every day you went into office, beginning in probably February of 1989, when things began to move in Poland, you knew every day you went into the office that history was being made and that you were a part of it. And to be able to spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day with the president as these huge decisions were being made, and the liberation of Eastern Europe, the unification of Germany and NATO, the collapse of the Soviet Union, victory in the Cold War, the Gulf War, was a moment that anyone interested in public service would consider just to be the epitome of an experience. And as I said earlier, he was a lot of fun to work with. And Brent and I had a division of labor, and Brent went on all of his international trips with him, and I went on all of his domestic trips. Well, Andy had to do all the work on the domestic trips, so I'd just get to tag along and be there and have breakfast with the president and show him the president's daily brief and basically observe American politics in all of its richness. But spending that amount of time with a president during such a historic period was just an unbelievable experience. And I'll just give you one anecdote for me. The president was trying to start the ground war against Saddam in Kuwait, and the French weren't going along with it. And I got a message from the Situation Room, and the president was on the phone in his little study with meter on. And I walked right through the Oval Office and into the study, and I handed him the little piece of paper, and it said that Saddam was setting the oil wells on fire in Kuwait. He read that to Mitterrand, and Mitterrand on the call said, "It's time to go. Let's move the forces." So it was just, I mean, that was kind of an everyday event, occurrence during that period. And what an extraordinary opportunity, and to be in the presence of somebody who handled all of it with such extraordinary skill was something I'll certainly never forget. And it also made that the most enjoyable job I think I ever had.
Thank you, sir. It's crushing me to say this, but we're out of time. Secretary Card, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to you and the Reverend for being such remarkable examples of and role models in public service. And Secretary Gates, thank you for exactly the same things, and best of luck on what is going to be an immediately best-selling book. Our very
Mark, could I just quickly add one more thing?
Oh, yes, sir.
The most enjoyable job I ever had, but a very close runner-up, was president of Texas A&M.
We were all reading between the lines there, sir. It's okay. Our very warm wishes to you, Becky, Eleanor, and Brad. Please stay healthy and safe. Our nation and our world still needs you both. Please take care of yourselves. It was an honor to have you here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Good night and giggle.